We'd like to welcome Attorney General Bill Schuette, Republican candidate for governor. Thank you so much for participating in our gubernatorial candidate interviews. I'm Jerome Vaughn from WDET. In the room today and doing the questions are the members of the Detroit Journalism Cooperative. The DJC is made up of 6 media outlets, including Detroit Public Television, Bridge Magazine, Michigan Radio, Chalkbeat Detroit, New Michigan Media, and of course WDET. We'd also like to thank the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation for support on this project. Today's panel, starting to my left, includes Kobe Levin from Chalkbeat Detroit, Lindsay VanHulle from Bridge Magazine, Bill Kubota from Detroit Public Television, and Tracy Samilton from Michigan Radio. So for the next hour, each journalist will ask a series of questions and will follow up on your answer if they need more specifics. I'll give us a 30-minute time reminder so that we can stay on track. And welcome.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Jerome and Tracy and Bill and Lindsay and Kobe. Been looking forward to this, and thank you for the opportunity.
Our first set of questions is about the subject of education, and that first question goes to Kobe Levin.
Hi, Mr. Schuette.
Call me Bill. It's much easier.
Bill, then, education experts across the political spectrum believe that Michigan needs to rethink the way it funds schools. They suggest that some students, like English learners and students with disabilities, need more resources to get an equitable education. Do you think Michigan schools have the resources they need to educate their students?
You know, I think that this issue of education, Kobe, is one of the most fundamental issues for Michigan's future and how we drive our state forward. And the issue of whether it's you know, a fresh start or a different approach, making sure those who have a tough challenge, whether it's autism, whether it's your family situation, we have to make sure that Michigan's children read. So I'm all for a review of our education plan in Michigan, because today in Michigan, our third grade reading scores are among the lowest in the nation, and that only 35% of our third graders, when they complete that class, are proficient in reading is outrageous. We ought to be up in arms about that. America's supposed to be described as a shining city on a hill, but if you can't read the directions to get there, or if you can't spell opportunity, you're out of luck. And out of hope. And the prism through which you see Michigan and you see America is cloudy, and it's pretty grim. And what's your future? Well, it's probably a life of crime, maybe in prison. But if you can't read, you're just out of hope here in Michigan. That has to change. And so I think it needs to be an outcome focus. How can our outcomes be better? And we need to have, from my perspective, a review of how the K-12 budget is allocated. And some of those monies have been going into higher education, which is a worthy cause, but I think our K through 12 budget, Kobe, needs to be used for K through 12 budget. And then we need to focus on outcomes. And from my standpoint, we need to grade our schools A through F. So a report card for families as to how good is your local school going. Now, I went to public schools in my hometown of Midland. So did my wife, and so did our 2 children. But you know, not everyone gets an education like that today. And the fact is, we need to provide grants to those schools that are showing improvement. I believe in incentives. So those schools that are showing higher performance, let's reward them with additional funds. And as governor, I'm going to have a literacy director in the governor's office because of the significance of reading. We need to have a culture of reading in Michigan. I'm going to build and create a Michigan Reading Foundation where the philanthropic and business community can invest, so we could have summer reading camps and reading coaches. And we need to work on pre-K reading as well. Reading is the fundamental issue.
I just want to jump in here.
Yeah, please.
So you mentioned a review of funding for education in Michigan. Right now, our funding system allocates about the same amount of money to every school, regardless of the challenges that its students face. Do you think that's the most equitable way to fund schools, or is there a different way?
Well, I think we have to look at how we can provide greater training for teachers. And for those who have a challenge in terms of their student population, how can we add to it? I'm all for that review. The fact is, we need to make sure that we have a new approach, because right now, the current plan is getting an F. When only 35% of our third graders are able to read, something's wrong. And that needs to be full focus and attention. It will be when I'm governor.
Thank you.
Dozens of schools are currently in partnership agreements with the state that lay out deadlines for improving test scores. What would you do if those schools fail to hit those targets?
Well, I look at it this way, that we need to have consistent markers. It's as if you, too often it seems here in Michigan, where we've changed the marker, we've changed the goalpost. If it'd be as if you were moving the field goal in different places on a football field. Let's have consistent markers, and let's use that as the determination as to are we succeeding or not. And if they're not succeeding in reading scores and test scores, then we're going to have to devote resources, people, and money in order to make sure we improve. The fact is, I want to be judged when I run for re-election as governor. Are more Michigan children reading? That will be my commitment. That is how I want to be judged. This issue of reading is fundamental to how Michigan improves in the future.
You know, as Attorney General, you argued in favor of school closures. Is that still your position, or would you look at a different approach? You
know, from my standpoint, you have to look at schools and see how we can make them improve and function better. But if a school is failing, if the school isn't doing the job, then we need to, first of all, make sure we help the parents and help the children. I think the education policy is a four-letter word, KIDS, and we need to focus on the children, education, and outcomes. That ought to be our focus, and nothing but that.
Bill, you talked about the K-12 budget.
Yes, sir.
But what about the preschool? We've got such a high cost of child care in this state. What should we do about that?
You know, I was talking about this precise issue with Reverend Jim Holley, who's a friend of mine and a leading thought guy in the city of Detroit. And we talked about this issue of pre-K and how we can help families and really the children get this quest for reading solved. See, I think every child is born with a sense of wonder and purpose. And the key thing is how we can unlock that for every child in this state. And I think the way to unlock it is reading. And that's why summer reading camps or and reading coaches to help children read, I think, is fundamental. And we need to start that as early as possible and work with parents and families. It's all about reading for Michigan's future.
Well, regarding pre-K, though, there's some reading going on there, but there's a universal pre-K model a lot of states are talking a lot about. What about here in Michigan, a universal pre-K?
Well, I think, you know, from my standpoint, we ought to look at every idea. And if it doesn't work, then try something else. The fact is, the current status quo won't work for Michigan. The status quo right now is failing Michigan's children. And I want to make sure that we increase our reading levels. And here's the point. When our high school graduates finish, some will be college ready. But they should not have to have remediation to go to college. And then they need to learn that in K through 12. And some children will be career ready. I think we need to have greater emphasis on apprenticeships and the skilled trades because there are important jobs, whether it's welding, coding, what have you. Not everybody, Bill, needs to be a software engineer living in San Mateo, California.
But
there are important jobs right here in Michigan.
Though. Let's go back to that. Do you see an expansion of a pre-K program, universal?
I'll look at that. I think you have to look at every fundamental idea on how we improve reading in Michigan. And I wish we could just wave a wand and solve every problem in the state in terms of education. But I am dedicated and determined on this issue of reading and education. And that's where I want to make sure we put down a marker so that Michigan's children read when Bill Schuette's governor.
Right. I think even in Oklahoma they're doing universal pre-K now.
Well, again, I think we ought to look at every one of those ideas, how we can implement it in Michigan, and then look at the priorities of where we have to go. And I'm running for governor because I want our state to grow. We need to be a growth state. We need to be a paycheck state. We need to be a job state. And I am not going to see Michigan be a smaller, shrinking state without sufficient resources. There's not one problem, whether it's pre-K or anything else, that wouldn't be solved, Bill, if we had more people in this state, more people paying taxes, pumping gas, what have you. And the fact is, we need to be a state that grows our population so we have more resources. So we're not a shrinking, smaller, less significant state where everyone will beat their chest saying, well, we have have smaller budgets, but we're allocating a shrinking pie. I want us to build the pie, Bill.
But so I guess you're taking it under advisement.
Yeah, I will. And I'm a good listener. And what I've learned in my experience in public service, and this is my calling, is to make sure that we bring the best people together. And management, leadership is about those you hire to work with you. And I'll have the finest women and men dedicated on this issue of reading and education. And we'll implement every sound policy we can to move our state forward.
Bill, I want to look at Detroit in particular. Chalkbeat and Bridge recently found that almost 1 in 3 parents are switching their kids' schools every single year, primarily to try to find a better school. They're realizing, oh, this school isn't working, let's try the next one. So, what are the problems you see in Detroit in particular, and what are the solutions you think we need to try there that we haven't tried before?
Well, I think a couple of things, Tracy. And first of all, whether you live in Detroit or whether you live in Flint or Traverse City or Ada or Benton Harbor or Alpena, the fact is you have parents and families who want their children to have an opportunity to participate in this incredible notion of freedom and Michigan and America. And when we see reading scores that have gone to the bottom in other states that are having better scores, whether it's math or whether it's a reading, it's a message that our current approach is not working. So we have to have some fundamental change. I think it's important that parents have choices, and they can choose where they want to send their child to school. So part of this, if a school's not working or if it's not isn't have the fit for your child, well, you should have the freedom to try a different school. So I think you're sharing that issue that parents want to have the best opportunity for their child. If the school's not working, you don't want them to be stuck in a bad situation.
Sure, but in Detroit, I mean, if you look at their test scores in particular, they're not just the lowest in Michigan. They're the lowest in the nation.
Well, about 48th or 49th, but this applies.
Down,
but it applies across the board, and it's not a regional issue, and it's not one part of the state versus the other. Our third grade reading scores are among the lowest in the nation. And what should we try? I think we should try, Tracy, to number one, grade our schools A through F, as I mentioned earlier. Second, we should provide grants and incentives for those schools that are showing better performance, and having a literacy director in the governor's office as an expression and a statement and a substance of making sure that Michigan's children read has not been done before. And number four, a Michigan Reading Foundation. That has been used in Florida. Jeb Bush has done that in great ways in the state of Florida. We should try to work that here in Michigan to have a culture of reading in our state. And look at it this way. Say you have a child who has a challenge or a special need. There may be a school that has a program that might fit that need, but the transportation costs of getting your child from one place to another might impede that. So if you had transportation scholarships funded through the Michigan Reading Foundation, you might give that family and parent a choice. Or maybe you want to go to a different school because your neighborhood one is not to your liking. Maybe it's not functioning as you wish. Having a transportation scholarship to get you to a different school would help as well. I think those are the things we need to try.
We're going to move on to the subject of roads now. How would you rate Michigan's roads compared to other states in terms of quality, and maybe even give it a letter grade?
Well, you know, Jerome, I don't think anyone travels on the roads across the two peninsulas and 83 counties as much as I do. Sometimes when I see some of these potholes, I have different words associated to them for nicknames, what have you. The fact is, I understand the problems we have in the roads today. And the predicate for why we need to invest more in a consistent, thorough fashion is that we can't be a first world economic leader or first world economic power if we have third world roads. And we need to make sure that the quest here and the solution is that the quality of our roads need to reflect the quality of our cars that are built here in Michigan. So that's really the goal here. I think our roads are, mediocre, and I think they're not sufficient, and we have to invest more in roads, bridges, and infrastructure in Michigan, which includes broadband, by the way. And I would do this. Number one, we need to have a view of an audit of how MDOT spends their money. And everyone talks about miles per gallon. What are the miles paved per gallon in terms of how we invest in roads and bridges and how they allocate transportation funds in MDOT, number one. Second, I think we ought to have guarantees and warranties for roads and bridges. Why is that important? Everything else that you buy and purchase has some sort of warranty or guarantee. We need to have that in the state of Michigan. Thirdly, what I'll do to help our state grow in terms of road funding is I have great relationships with the administration, the President and Vice President in Congress. I'm a former member of Congress. I know how that place operates. And I'll be an advocate for Michigan to get more road funding, federal funding, and working with our senators and congressional delegations so that we are more of a donee receiving state than always sending money to Washington, not getting enough in return. And then finally, we have a state budget of $58 billion. That's a lot of money. And our budget has gone up in the past 8 years. Not being critical, I'm just saying that's a fact. But we need to, and there's a plan in place for road funding, but we need to add to it. And that means that we need to allocate more funding for roads. And I, as governor, and Lisa Postumus-Lyons, an outstanding choice for lieutenant governor. We need to talk about her qualities and strengths. She and I will be on the floor of the Michigan House and Michigan Senate getting more road funding and establishing that as a priority. Every one of our listeners who has a small business or involved in some type of enterprise establishes priorities in their business. I'm going to establish a priority of roads for Michigan's future. Now, my opponent wants to tax everything that moves, and when she says she wants to fix the road, that's code language. She's going to raise your darn taxes. And so the fact is, my opponent wants to raise taxes on, and what are you going to put in an infrastructure bank? You're going to put your taxes and everybody else's taxes. And that's the recipe that sent us into a spiral of more taxes and more government mandates that Jennifer Granholm did during her 8 years. And Gretchen Whitmer, Senator Whitmer, was one of the key architects. And those ingredients that sent us back to the lost decade, we're not going to go that way. We're going to go forward in Michigan, but what we don't need is start raising people's taxes.
Before we talk about how to pay for roads, let's try to get a sense of how much they'd cost. The 21st Century Infrastructure Commission has said that Michigan needs at least $2.6 billion just to fix the roads that we already have. Do you think that's a reasonable figure?
Well, I think that the investment we make needs to be consistent, thorough, and I'm working with those leaders and thought leaders in transportation and the road industry. That 2 billion or 4 billion, that's 20 or 30 or 40 cents per gallon. That's not going to fly. That's, raising that much taxes would send us backwards. What we need to do is work within the budget of the state of Michigan, which is $58 billion. I think you can find the investment to have consistent funding, enhanced road funding for Michigan's future.
But do you agree that to get the roads up to par, it would cost $2.6 billion?
Well, I'm going to work with the Michigan Infrastructure Commission, and we'll talk with road leaders in the future. The fact is that we need to, I think everybody agrees we need to have consistent enhanced funding for roads. But trying to raise gas taxes by 20 cents a gallon or 30 cents a gallon or 40 cents a gallon, that's just not going to work. And frankly, it's wrong.
You mentioned it earlier. One of the things that you would do to fix the roads would be to do that top to bottom audit of MDOT.
Yeah.
How will that help improve Michigan's roads, and how much money do you anticipate that it would free up?
Well, it's all part of a process. Again, going through a spirited campaign, and when the dust settles and the polls close, I'm going to win this race by a narrow margin, 52-48, whatever it is, and we're going to win. And then we'll start a process of how we build towards the future. And we'll work with the Michigan Department of Transportation, other leaders in the transportation industry and see how we can be more efficient, see how they allocate it, see what other fresh new ideas we can have, and then we'll move forward. And then there'll be the budget process in January and February, and Lisa Postumus-Lyons and I will be working with the leaders in the legislature, Republican leaders in the House, Republican leaders in the Senate, Democrat leaders in the House and Senate as well. I'm good at bipartisanship. I know how to get things done. I put together a commission on human trafficking where I worked with Republicans and Democrats. And now, in Michigan, we have a victim-centered, victim-centric approach to combat human trafficking, and where women who are forced to have sex are treated as victims, not criminals. And I worked on sexual assault kit funding to, prosecute serial rapists, and put together a school safety initiative called OK to Say. And so the fact is, I know how to work with in a bipartisan fashion. And my gosh, in Flint, the prosecutor there is a Democrat who's a great friend of mine, outstanding leader. We ran against each other in 2010, but we know how to solve problems, and that's the type of approach, Lindsay, I'll take as Michigan's next governor.
As to the
Go ahead.
as to the audit portion, though, is the thinking behind that there's some inefficiencies, or that MDOT is not using its funding appropriately, or that it's not putting enough toward roads that it could be?
I think it's all about how a department is run. Again, I'm not casting aspersions or stones or anything like that, but the fact is you do an audit to see how it's been run, and you do an audit to see how we can improve, and you don't go in with any preconceived notion. But I think it's meritorious. There's merit in having every aspect of government reviewed and say, okay, how do we go forward? We've had great 8 years, and the real question for Michigan is, do you go forward or backwards? And I want to make sure we go forward, and part of that is how we can allocate and have taxpayers' resources spent in an even more efficient fashion.
Well, maybe that's my follow-up to Kobe, talking about the $2.6 billion. It doesn't seem like you're all that in agreement with that number. Looking for a lower number here?
Again, I guess the point is that, I'll have this privilege to serve as Michigan's governor, and we'll take a review of past reports. We'll take a review of past suggestions and say, okay, it's 2019. How do we go forward? How do we best use resources in Michigan in the future? And that's the approach I'll take, and I think it's a sound approach.
So regarding that number, though, what do you think?
Well, you know what? Again, I'm not hung up on is the number $2 billion or is the number $3 billion. The fact is that we'll have a team and approach that want to build on the success of the past 8 years of Governor Snyder and our Republican leadership and how we move this state forward. And so, it's really not an issue of a number. It's about what are the outcomes and how do we make sure that we move the state forward, and how do we have the legislature agree to work with the governor, who will be hands-on, former member of Congress, former member of the Michigan Senate. I know how to, what the requirements of the women and men in the legislature to do their job, and I'll work with them so we have success on roads, bridges, and infrastructure.
Well, you were talking a little bit about numbers regarding the repealing the Michigan prevailing wage law. The savings could be up to $250 million.
Right.
You have been talking about that. We haven't heard that much about that from you lately.
Well, you know, the prevailing wage statute, the elimination of that gives Michigan a more competitive edge. And what it does is also saves taxpayers money, because it will be done on competitive bidding, not a set price or cost. And again, my opponent, Senator Whitmer, wants to go backwards and reinstate the prevailing wage statute. I'm a right-to-work Attorney General. I'll be a right-to-work governor. I supported that. Now, again, my opponent, Senator Whitmer, wants to go backwards, and she wants to repeal right to work. Again, I'm about going forward and trying to reinstate the policies of the failed governorship of Jennifer Granholm is the wrong way for Michigan to go. Because remember, we had 15% unemployment, we lost 500,000 jobs, and people left the state in droves. Sometimes people forget what the failed governorship, the lost decade of Jennifer Granholm was. You know, was at a company last week, and a woman came up to me. Her name was Pam, And she said that now she has to go to Georgia to see her family because some of her family members are the ones who left our state during the lost decade. We can't go back there, Bill, and we have to make sure that we compete and win against any other state in America. That's my paycheck agenda, to drive our state forward, not going backward.
One quick follow-up on that. This is a subject we've been talking about for years and years and years. The public has said it's a top agenda item for them. Why are we still at this point?
In terms of
not having the roads fixed.
Yeah. Well, you know what? And it's your question's a good one, and it is about leadership. It's about drive, and no disrespect. Our past two governors, Governor Granholm and Governor Snyder, did not have legislative experience, and I do in a strong and effective and accomplished fashion as a member of Congress, as a member of the Michigan Senate, and I understand the motivation, the requirements, how they have to deliver, the women and men in the legislature, to do their job and make sure that they're performing at a high level. And I am a detailed guy, and I'll be on the floor. I'm a hands-on guy, and I will want to encourage people. And this is just like auto insurance reform, the same issue as to roads. The fact is, we haven't had auto insurance reform in Michigan, and we have the highest auto insurance rates in America, $1,000 more than any other state. Why hasn't that gotten done? Because you'd have to have the leadership that's required, and I'll provide that, to bring parties together to say, okay, we need to have this consistent road funding. This is how we lower auto insurance rates in Michigan. And on that, I'll talk with Mayor Duggan, and I think I'm Mayor Duggan's and Detroit's best hope, because we're going to have a Republican senator, Senate, and a Republican House, and we need to have a Republican governor to help drive this through and help Mike Duggan and Detroiters have lower auto insurance.
We're going to move on to the subject of the environment. Tracy?
Yeah, you brought up Flint. I'd like to ask you how you're going to make this transition from your role, your prosecutorial role in helping people in Flint, to the governor and making sure people are actually getting what they need.
And I'm glad you asked this question and defined it in I think, an important way. Flint is a city where some people like to play politics with. Flint is a city that I think wrongly, some people view it as the citizens of Flint are some pawns on a chessboard. That's wrong. I, as Attorney General, started an independent investigation of what laws were, if any, were broken in Flint. And remember, 12 people died in Flint, and kids were poisoned. I took an oath, Tracy, twice, as Attorney General, to enforce the laws of the state of Michigan. So help me God. Did that twice. Did it in January 1st of 2011, January 1st of 2015. And when kids were poisoned and people died, I did my job. Now, some folks wanted me to just ignore it and brush it under the rug. What a caustic, arrogant approach that is. And you know what? And it would have been political if I'd done nothing and just pretend it didn't occur. I would have violated my oath. So I make no apologies for making sure that we have a trial process now. I make no apologies that people have pled guilty to crimes, because I know families in Michigan and Flint today that only drink water from a plastic bottle. They wash their vegetables only with water from a plastic bottle. And so
it's expensive to do that.
Well, you know what?
What are you going to do to help them as governor?
And I'm helping them as governor because I'm the guy who took on a problem and filed charges where some, even in my own party, didn't want that to occur. Well, you know what? I'm doing my job. I make no apologies for that. And I'm the candidate for governor who stood up for this process and this principle that there is one system of justice. And it applies to everybody, no matter who you are, whether you're a big shot or no shot at all. And I think that's important in terms of my character and how I approach things. Then as governor, this is an issue of rebuilding trust in government. And I met with some pastors in Flint just this past week and listened to them in terms of how they and their parishioners, members of their congregation, are still questioning the faith and trust in government. And gee, you wonder why. And until we rebuild trust and replace the pipes, people will still drink water from a plastic bottle. And I think we need to, I'm going to rebuild trust because I'm the guy who had the courage and steadfastness to provide justice to families of Flint. And we need to make sure we replace those pipes from the street to the house.
Do they have enough money to do that right now?
Well, you know what? We need to make sure it's done. And then there are a host of other issues in Flint in terms of jobs and safety. And that's why when I work with David Layton, the Democrat prosecutor in Flint, and Bob Pickell, the Democrat sheriff in Flint, it's an example that, yeah, you can have Republicans and Democrats working together, and you know what? You can solve some problems. Just an example in Flint, David Layton and I have worked on the opioid issue together. David Layton and I have worked on this issue of sexual assault kits, providing justice to women who experienced a brutal rape, a horrific crime, and then nothing had been done. And all these sexual assault kits, in a warehouse in Detroit. But now I was able to get the funding and work with prosecutors like David Layton and others to make sure that there's justice for victims of serial rapists in the state of Michigan.
Governor Snyder has announced a deal with Enbridge to replace the controversial and aging Line 5 pipeline beneath the Straits of Mackinac with a tunnel. You called it, quote, an important step forward in safeguarding our Great Lakes. But environmentalists say it still doesn't resolve the issue and will take years to build. Is the tunnel the right solution? If so, why? If not, why not?
I think the tunnel is a very good solution. Over 2 years ago, or close to 2 years ago, I laid out a plan and a framework with respect to Line 5. And clearly, its days are numbered. Its days are numbered, and we're going to have to replace that with a different approach for making sure that we also provide propane for our citizens in the Upper Peninsula and northern Michigan. Heavy reliance on propane for heating. We also need to make sure that our energy producers and be able to get their product to market. We also should have a pipeline advisory board, which is similar to the Mackinac Island Advisory Board right now. And legislatively, we need to make sure that no heavy crudes pass through the 4.5 miles of the Straits of Mackinac. I think that the tunnel is a very good idea. I've advocated for that in the past. I'm glad that there's an agreement now, and that the sooner we get to work on that, the better.
How big of a problem is PFAS for Michigan?
Kobe, PFAS is a big problem for our state, and we've seen it, and I think our listeners are aware of this in a variety of different areas and across the state. We've seen it in Parchment outside of Kalamazoo. We've seen it in Rockford north of Grand Rapids. We've seen it at near Alpena in the Wurtsmith Air Force Base, where sometimes it's fire retardant. It might be another processes of a business where it's leached into the aquifers and cause severe problems with the water table. And what we need to do in Michigan is make sure we devote sufficient state resources to providing first clean and safe water to the citizens there, and then having a cleanup process and working with the federal government on that. And again, this is where my relationships, I'm a relationship guy. I'm not perfect, but I'm a relationship guy, and by my knowledge of how Congress works, I think that helps us in terms of federal funding to help on cleanup, and also it helps my relationship, because I'm a relationship guy within the state legislature, to work in conjunction with the federal government to try to clean up those areas. Remember, Article 1 in the Constitution of Michigan talks about safety. And I think that also means safe drinking water, and we owe that to citizens of Michigan.
So how does that plan to deal with PFAS line up with your stated goal of reducing regulations, broadly speaking, in Michigan?
Well, I think that, again, two separate issues. This is the 21st century. This is the 21st century. We ought to be able to have economic development in the state of Michigan and sound environmental practices and sound stewardship. Etched in the DNA, I think, of every citizen of Michigan, because we're surrounded by these marvelous Great Lakes, and we all enjoy them, whether it's a Memorial Day, Labor Day, whether it's, fishing in the winter, ice fish, doesn't matter. We're part of this environment, and we have a responsibility there. But we also need to make sure we have jobs and paychecks for families in the state of Michigan. And so we can have cleanup standards. We can have making sure, for example, in terms of our Great Lakes, I want to have high standards for discharge. I don't want to have the lower federal standards, as an example. I think you can make decisions that to protect our Great Lakes, and we can also expand economic development. Because if we don't grow our state, if we're a shrinking state, I don't care whether you make furniture in West Michigan, whether it's cars in Detroit, or everything in between, if we have a shrinking, growing population, it's not sustainable. And I'm an optimist. I'm Michigan's optimist. But the fact is, if we don't grow our state, have more flexible regulations that are competitive, and tax policies that are competitive, Kobe, with the Tennessees and Texas and Carolinas, there'll be more and more people leaving Michigan. And here's the best, a great indicator, is that Michigan once, and we're talking economic development and environmental policy here, Michigan once had 19 members of Congress. After this next census, we're going to have 13. What does that tell you? It tells you that other states are growing faster than Michigan. And I want us to compete and win for jobs and paychecks in Michigan against the Tennessees and the Texases and the Carolinas. And I think we can do that and still have sound environmental policy.
Just so the panelists know, as well as the candidate, we're at the 30-minute mark. The next question goes to Lindsay.
Thank you. You know, funding for environmental cleanups is becoming an issue in Michigan. Governor Snyder has talked about raising fees. Still others have talked about bonding as a preferred approach. Which of those two, if any, do you favor? If none of those, what would be your plan to raise money for environmental cleanups?
Well, I think that the issue, if you approach it this way, right now, what Michigan needs to do is make sure that we have a process of more jobs and bigger paychecks for the state of Michigan. Our number one goal is to make sure that we build and grow our state. And every one of these problems we've talked about education, we're talking about the environment, we can talk about roads, we can talk about infrastructure. Every one of these problems we've talked about would be helped or minimized if we had more people in our state. More people pumping gas, more people paying taxes, more people going to school, all of that. But if we have a slowly shrinking pie, then it'll put great strain on our resources. You know, from my standpoint, always looking to raise fees and have more taxes will set Michigan back. I'm going to look at how we can best have cleanup processes, and I'm going to work with the leaders in the industry. I think the continual, Lindsay, the continual comment I say is, hear from people is, work with us when you want to put together a program. Let's work together when we're trying to have more cleanup approaches for our environment. And that's what I'll do with people. The immediate reaction to raise fees, I think, is a wrong idea.
Do you then prefer bonds? Is that?
You know, it's an option, but again, I'm going to get there as governor with a talented group of people, and we'll say, okay, it's education. It's cutting the income taxes. It's lowering auto insurance rates. And the next governor, Lindsay, will have a short period of time to make big changes in our state and to move forward. And we can't have small aspirations. They need to be big aspirations. Bold moves, otherwise your capital in the town of Lansing, it sinks like a stone. And I'm not going to let that happen. So in my first days, weeks, months, and as governor, we're going to eliminate the Granholm-Whitmer income tax increase that was supposed to have been temporary, but it's funny how a temporary tax can be permanent in Lansing. We're going to drive a stake through that, and then we're going to cut auto insurance rates. In the meantime, we'll look at, okay, what are the environmental cleanup approaches we should take, and how do we make sure we get more money into roads? That's the approach I will take.
So is it fair to say that at this time you don't have a preferred solution?
I'm open to review what the approaches are, but let me tell you, a best approach might be, I'm not going to raise taxes and fees. That's not what we should do.
Let me continue on that just a little bit. You talk about you're going to consult with leaders in industry in your plan to fix
and environmental leaders and citizens. Don't worry, I'm not leaving anybody out.
That was my question.
Because it's on all of these issues. If you come in, and this is the experience and skill set I have, Bill. If you come in with a preconceived notion to try to how you're going to, this is what you have to do, without having a table where people on all sides are part of it, you get nothing done. I mean, an example, on auto insurance rates. You know, we pay $1,000 more than any other state in America. And I was in a parade in Macomb County, St. Clair Shores, just before Memorial Day. Guy came up, grabbed me by the shirt, and he was relatively polite, but he made his point. He said, "Schuette, we got to cut auto insurance rates," and told me the story about his daughter not moving to Michigan because of the high cost of auto insurance rates. So how do you solve that problem? Well, it's the same way you'd solve this issue on environmental problems. You bring people around a table on auto insurance. You bring the auto insurers. You bring the hospitals, the medical providers, the Chamber of Commerce, and everyone's going to have to give a little bit, and everyone's going to have to win a little bit. With respect to environmental matters, you bring in the environmental groups, industry groups, and activists, and you bring them around a table and say, how can we solve the problem? That's how I do business, and that's how I'll do it as governor.
I'm not going
to leave anybody out, so
a little more about line 5 here. Its days are numbered.
Yeah.
This tunnel's going to take a while to build. You turn off line 5 now and wait for that tunnel to get built?
Well, I think what we need to do is this announcement by the governor, I think, is a positive step. And I'll continue to review that approach of the tunnel. I think it's the right approach. The tunnel is the right approach. I've advocated for that. And the sooner we get that job done, the better. And
the time that this line 5 is still running, you know.
Well, let's start the construction on the tunnel, and this can be this will provide visual inspection. It'll be a kind of a utility corridor for other transmission, electrical and otherwise, through those 4.5 miles of the Straits of Mackinac. I think it's a very good first step, Bill.
Okay.
So let's transition. We've started the transition from the environment to the economy. Tracy?
Bill, you've mentioned a few times in terms of where we're going to find the money we need. That we've got $58 billion budget.
Yeah,
we'll
we
find
do.
It somewhere.
That's a fact.
But in reality, a lot of that is already, protected, allocated for programs that we have to fund. So in reality, we've got about $10 billion here to work with. We've got $2.6 billion of that maybe we might need to do for roads. We don't really have a huge pot that we can play with. Do we need to increase that pot? How do we do it?
I think your question's about economic growth and how does Michigan plan for the future? How do we build for the future? And Tracy, I look at it this way. We were on the mat 8 years ago. We were on the mat. We're on life support. Again, we had 15% unemployment, lost 500,000 jobs, and people left the state in droves. And some of our kids just didn't come back. And the question for voters is, okay, are we going to go forward and build on the success of the last 8 years, where now we have in Michigan the lowest unemployment rates we've seen in decades. We have a desire for more talent and to fill jobs, which means talent's another word for we've got to grow our population, for crying out loud. Otherwise, we'll be a shrinking state. And here's my viewpoint, Tracy, and you may not agree with me, and that's okay. But our job to make Michigan a leading state in America, we have to compete against the Tennessees, where 110 people move to Tennessee every day. Or in Austin, a 747 plane load of people arrive in the Austin Metroplex every day to live and work. Now, why do they do that? It's not the weather. And we all know, I bet you everybody here, and then the listening audience, knows that people have moved to the Carolinas or Florida or Texas. And why do they do that? It's because their taxes are lower, their economic development costs are lower, and you get to keep more of what you earn. So if we're going to grow our state, we better compete and win. And that is my point. I think we need to expand the pie instead of, oh my gosh, those who worry about we can't, we have to raise taxes to pay for everything. If we don't lower our taxes, if we don't lower our costs of investment for economic development enterprise, we will be a vacation state. People will come to visit Michigan, but they won't be here to live. I want people to come to Michigan to live because this is their home, and I want them to do this for 6 months and a day. Now, where they spend the other 5 months and 29 days, you know, I could kind of care less. I mean, I wish them well, but I want them to be Michigan residents where we have people who live in Michigan, not just vacationing. And so that's why our economic growth plan and my paycheck plan, Tracy, of cutting taxes, eliminating the Granholm-Whitmer income tax is important. And why do tax cuts help? Well, just look at it here in Michigan. The administration and the Republicans in Congress have cut taxes on a federal level. And now what's happening? The Ram truck is going to be moved from Mexico to Michigan. Now, when is the last time you've ever heard about jobs coming from Mexico to Michigan? And that's 2,600 jobs at the Warren truck plant, not too far where we're filming this effort here. And every Chrysler automotive worker is getting a $2,000 tax cut bonus and a $1 billion investment at the Warren truck plant. Cutting taxes helps grow our economy. I want to do that in Michigan because I want us to grow and have more jobs. That's my approach.
Well, I think nobody would argue that cutting taxes doesn't have some benefit for growing the economy, but the link is not, it's not dramatic, it's not powerful. We need to do other things. And a lot of people are saying, if I have to choose between lowering taxes, cutting taxes more, or fixing the roads, the polls are showing that people want the roads fixed.
Oh, listen, and we can fix the roads, but the fact is that, you know, look at our state right now. Look at our state right now. We have lowered taxes. I want to eliminate the Granholm-Whitmer income tax increase. We've seen what taxes cuts on the national level have done with, it's pretty dramatic. I would respectfully differ with you. Pretty dramatic to have a 2,600 new jobs coming to the Warren truck plant and the Ram being produced in Michigan instead of Mexico. I'd call that very dramatic. And so I think growth policies are important for our state. And just like reducing auto insurance rates, this is an important discussion we should have, because when you're just think of families sitting around their kitchen table, they got too much a month, not enough check, and when you look at your auto insurance rates that are chewing a lot of that up, people, that has to end.
So what's your approach to economic development tax incentives? Does Michigan have too many or not enough, or are we just at the right place right now?
You know, I believe in, your question's a good one, Jerome. I believe in economic incentives. They need to be balanced. I look at it this way. Any business, it could be a large corporation or it could be a small business, is big for Michigan, and small businesses really help drive the state. We should have balanced incentives that apply to both businesses that are large and small businesses that may be small, but they can really rev and generate growth and jobs and paychecks for people in the state. And I think we all have to realize it's an economic civil war out there. It is a battle for jobs across America. And I was with Governor Haslam, governor of Tennessee, just 3 weeks ago, and we talked about when he goes to Asia or Europe to try to have foreign direct investment come home to his state of Tennessee, the first question they ask, are you right to work? And so this is an example of how Michigan is getting retooled for the future. I'm for right to work, and that'll help us go forward. And Gretchen Whitmer wants to eliminate right to work, which will take us back, which we can't go. And so the point is, we need to have the incentives and tools in Michigan that propel job growth. And here's also what I do, Jerome. I'm going to make a beeline for Illinois. Why? Because that state is so messed up. They've got so many taxes. They can't balance their budget. And so we need to go there for entrepreneurs and for companies and say, come to Michigan. This is a state where we balance our state budget, where we're cutting taxes, where we want to remove the heaviness of mandates and have this be this is a growth state. I think we can build our state's economy by also attracting businesses to Michigan with incentive packages. So I think balanced incentives are good for the future, Jerome.
Let me ask one thing regarding that. You say Illinois. Any other states you're sniping for?
Well, Illinois is a Yeah, I look at our neighbors. I would look at Illinois. I'd also look at other states like New York. I think there's great opportunity here. There's an ethic and a spirit of enterprise and entrepreneurism. We see it in Detroit now, where we're rebuilding a city that some thought never would happen. And again, Detroit's a city of 138 square miles, and Detroit's future is about jobs. It's about education, and it's about safety. I think that applies to any city, whether it's big or small. But this spirit of enterprise of Michigan that was carved out of the wilderness, that was the arsenal of democracy, I think our attitude, and I talk about this a lot, our attitude has to be that Michigan must be the best place for any family to raise their children and build their futures and have a job. And that's the attitude everybody must have for Michigan's future. Not that, oh my gosh, all the jobs are going to go to Illinois, or all the jobs go to Tennessee and Carolina. It's nonsense. I don't believe that.
So you've already talked quite a bit about auto insurance reform. Let's just get down to brass tacks on this.
Thanks for asking the question.
So do you think Michigan should keep its unique in the nation unlimited lifetime medical benefits?
And your question is smack dab on target. And for our listening audience, the issue is that Michigan has the highest auto insurance rates in the United States of America, $1,000 more than on average than any other state. And this story of the guy in the parade that I mentioned earlier on our show, where his daughter's not coming to Michigan, resonated with me, and it's repeated wherever I go. I was up in the UP at Stormy Cromer, and one of the employees there said, "Hey, Bill, what's going on? Why aren't you cutting auto insurance rates?" It happens wherever I go, and so we have to lower auto insurance rates. And what you're talking about is the catastrophic fund, where we have unlimited medical benefits forever. And here's what has to happen on this issue of auto insurance. And here are the three principles, Kobe. Number one, we need to crack down on insurance fraud. Secondly, we need to stop the frivolous lawsuits of the trial lawyers, and that has to end. And then thirdly, I think what's fair is giving citizens across the state an option of what their choices and coverage should be. And how do you obtain that? You have this table, and you bring the hospitals on one side. And next to them you'll have the Chamber of Commerce. Next to them you'll have business leaders. Next to them you'll have those in the medical profession and the trial lawyers. And here's the predicate here is that people in Michigan must have lower auto insurance. Mike Duggan agrees with me. And again, Duggan is a great friend of mine. He's a Democrat, so we have different choirs, so to speak. But we have something in common, a lot of things in common, actually. And it's about how we can have lower auto insurance rate for people in Detroit and across the state. And what I'll say is, Mayor, we need about 3 votes in the Michigan Senate. Mayor, from the Democrat side. Mayor, we're going to need about half a dozen votes in the Michigan House of Representatives, and then we'll put together a package where everyone gives a little bit and everyone wins a little bit, and the biggest winners have to be the citizens of the state of Michigan. The status quo is unacceptable. The status quo is unacceptable that Michigan pays $1,000 more than any other state. We have to be a growth state. If we just do this same approach, that's wrong.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We've got just about 10 minutes left. We're going to move on to some questions about social issues. Lindsay?
Good.
Thanks. As you know, after the Grand Rapids Chamber's endorsement of your candidacy, some businesses said that they were planning to leave the chamber, citing the Attorney General opinion that you wrote, looking at the Civil Rights Commission's ability to interpret statute. Mm-hmm. You've made it clear that you think that they're not able on their own to interpret statute, and that's really the legislature's job. As governor, you'll have the ability to work with the legislature on setting policy, and so I wonder, do you think that we need to expand Elliott Larson to include protections against discrimination for LGBT individuals?
Lindsay's question is a really good one. It's about LGBTQ and having a Michigan that has no discrimination. And here's how I make decisions, and here's who I am. You know, my dad died when I was 6, and my mom raised my 2 older sisters and me as a single mom. And she taught us, my 2 older sisters, Sandra and Gretchen, who's the real Gretchen in my life, if I may add, Gretchen Schuette, who will be in Michigan, and you'll get to meet her. But my mom raised my 2 older sisters and me as a single mom, and she taught us that everybody has to be treated with dignity and grace and respect. And it's, you know, the people with whom you work, you live, you play sports, you meet, have to be, it's all part of a larger family and how you deal with people with honor. Now, as governor, I'm going to make sure that I treat everybody with respect and dignity and grace, just like my mom taught me. Now, you may not always agree with every decision I make, whether it's on roads or you know, environmental policy or whatever. But the fact is, I'll treat everybody with dignity, honor, and respect. And I was asked, Lindsay, by a legislator in my official capacity as Attorney General to give a legal opinion whether 8 unelected people to a commission could change the law. Well, the answer is no. You know, it's Civics 101, that only the legislature in the Michigan Constitution can change a law, and that has to be signed by the governor. And so that was my legal opinion. And that opinion's been stretched and misrepresented because of the politics and you know, which again is just nonsense. And my viewpoint is, Lindsay, that we need to have a state that is hopeful and welcoming and attracts talent and people from across America, regardless of your sexual orientation, your ethnicity, your creed, your color. It doesn't matter. And so as governor, I will have a state called Michigan that where there's no discrimination, whether that's on race, color, sexual orientation, gender identity, creed, ethnicity, religion. We'll have a state with no discrimination. So I'll work with the legislature, as Lisa Posthumous-Lyons will, to make sure that we have a Michigan where we pass laws that there's no discrimination.
You know, to be clear, does that mean that you support expanding the Elliott Larson Act?
I will work with the legislature to make sure that our laws in Michigan, whether it's Elliott Larson or anything else, that we have a crystal clear approach that in Michigan there's no place for discrimination, period.
Well, would that mean expanding that law crystal clear?
Yeah, if Elliott Larson can be expanded, as long as, and I think so, that where there's no discrimination, period, Bill. And
so
that means
we're expanding the law to include LGBT.
And making sure that there's no discrimination, whether it's sexual orientation or gender or religion or color or creed or ethnicity. There can be no discrimination in Michigan. And let's pass a law that reflects that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let me ask another question, though. What are you going to do about the opioid crisis here in Michigan?
You know that I have a friend of mine. His name is Peter. And some years ago we were talking on the phone, and he shared with me his the fact that his son was addicted to opioids. And we started talking about it. He said, Bill, I want you to go to recovery center, and then you call me back. He was going to give me a homework assignment, Bill. And I did. And when you go to a recovery center, you'll see that opioids, they have no discrimination. Young, old, rich, poor, rural, urban, doesn't matter what your income level is. And when I met with this group for about an hour and a half, almost 2 hours, and you hear the stories of how this one woman had an athletic injury and was overprescribed on opioids. And then it's so easy then to fall into this trap with the heroin, with plentiful supply, sadly, and low cost, even more tragically. And so I called the guy back, my friend, and we talked more about it. And he had found his son on the floor. He was able to revive him, and we, you know, we cried about what his son had to go through. And this opioid crisis is real. You have more pills that have been prescribed in 2016 than there are people in Michigan. More people have died because of opioid and heroin abuse than are killed in auto accidents. So it's real. You can't arrest your way out of it. You have to do a couple of different things. It's treatment and education. That's important. We had I was with Walgreens folks a month ago where they have kiosks they're trying to put into their stores to get rid of that, the stuff in your grandparents' medicine cabinet. But also, I've cracked down on the pill mill docs as Attorney General and the heroin dealers with a unit that's focused just on stopping the pill mill docs and filed charges on them to send a message that those merchants of death aren't permitted here in the state of Michigan.
Do we expand treatment, and what kind of treatment?
I think you have to expand treatment for those who are going through this and trying to get clean from the grip of addiction. And so, yes, we have to expand treatment and help for those who trying to, get free of this addiction and have a positive life here in Michigan.
And I'm just wondering what kind. Some people talk a lot about medically assisted treatment versus abstinence-based treatment.
I think you have to have options for both. I think the behavioral health problem is a big issue. The abstinence is also certainly a positive, important thing, and how you can have medical assistance as well. I think you have to have various options.
And more money to do all of that?
Well, you're going to have to again do with every way you can, and obviously resources need to be maximized, and it has to be what's the best outcome based.
We've got time for just one last question, and this will be a little bit about politics, and we'll give that last question
politics.
to
The tawdry side of politics here.
So you talk on your campaign page. You talk about being a foot soldier of Ronald Reagan, and you have sought the endorsement of President Trump. So what are the values here that you're saying you share with these two individuals?
I appreciate President Trump's efforts to cut taxes in America, which meant we have the Ram truck moving from Mexico to Michigan. I appreciate that economic message. And also the trade agreement that was announced between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, because we rebalanced trading relationships. I think that's important because for too long, the elites in America viewed manufacturing as it just wasn't cool. And kind of the forgotten states where we make things and the grit and determination we know is Michigan. And having rebalancing trade relationships, encouraging manufacturing, I think that's an important value. Ronald Reagan was a guy, and when I was I was the second youngest congressman in the United States of America. And Ronald Reagan I looked to as a guy who stood up against communism, stood for freedom. And this country is a place of enterprise. His quote, I think, captures it best, that America is a special land inhabited by those people who have a love of freedom, faith, and peace, and situated between two great oceans so that this place called America can thrive. And that's a value system I get from Ronald Reagan. And I've had the privilege to work with presidents, seen them up close, and that helps me in terms of how I lead Michigan in the future.
All right. That's all the time we have. Thank you very much for
Thank you. I've enjoyed this. Thank you very much for the privilege of being here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Bill.